Alright, my objective for this video is adding integers. First, there are two terms that I need to know, which are integers and absolute value. Integers are the set of whole numbers and their opposites. Basically, integers are just my positive and negative whole numbers. The absolute value of a number is its distance from 0 on a number line. Basically, it's the value of a number if you ignore the sign. I'm going to use a number line to add my integers. Here I have a simple example, 4 plus 3. If I use my number line to add these two numbers, I'm going to start with whichever number my expression starts with. My expression starts with 4, so on my number line I will start at positive 4. When I add 3 to my number, I know that my number will get larger by 3. I also know that numbers on the number line get larger as I move to the right. So on my number line, I will move to the right 3 spaces. 1, 2, 3. When I move to the right 3 spaces, I end up at 7. Obviously, 4 plus 3 is equal to 7. The purpose of this example was just to get an idea of how to use the number line when I'm adding. Here, though, I have 5 plus negative 6. This time I'm adding a negative. If I start on the number where my expression starts, which is 5, if I were adding a positive 6, I would move to the right on the number line. But here I'm adding a negative 6, so I'm going to do the opposite of moving to the right, and I'll move to the left, negative 6. I know that my numbers get smaller as I go to the left on a number line. I also know that if I'm adding a negative to a number, that my number will get smaller. So when I move to the left 6 spaces, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, I end up at negative 1. So 5 plus negative 6 is negative 1. Here I have negative 6 plus 4. This time I'm starting with a negative. So on the number line I will start with negative 6. If I'm adding 4, my number will get larger by 4. So I need to move to the right on the number line 4 spaces. When I move to the right, 1, 2, 3, 4, I end up at negative 2. So negative 6 plus 4 is negative 2. Here I'm starting with negative 8 and I'm adding 15. If I start on the number line at negative 8 and I add 15, my number will get larger by 15, so I know that I need to move to the right 15 spaces. Starting at negative 8 and moving to the right, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, I end up at positive 7. So negative 8 plus 15 is 7. Here I'm adding two negatives. Negative 3 plus negative 6. I'm starting with negative 3, so on my number line, I will start at negative 3. When I add negatives, my number will get smaller. If I were adding 6, I would move to the right 6, but because I'm adding the opposite, I'm going to move in the opposite direction, so I'm going to move to the left 6 spaces. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Moving to the left 6 spaces puts me at negative 9, so negative 3 plus negative 6 equals negative 9. I have a few rules for adding integers that can help me remember a simpler way than having to use the number line. First, I have adding a negative. is the same as subtracting a positive. Next I have, when adding a positive and a negative, you can take the difference of their absolute values, and the sum will have the sign of the number with the larger absolute value. Last I have, to add two negatives, you can add their absolute values, and the sum will be negative. Now I want to take a look at the same 5 examples that I used when I was using the number line to add. First I have 4 plus 3. Adding two positives is simple. We've been doing it since we started working with numbers. 4 plus 3 is 7. I don't necessarily need a rule to remember how to add two positive numbers. But here I'm adding a positive and a negative. My rule was, when adding a positive and a negative, you can take the difference of their absolute values and take the sign of the number with the larger absolute value. Absolute value of 5 and negative 6 is 5 and 6. The difference of 5 and 6 is 1, but since my negative number had the larger absolute value, then my sum will also be negative. Here I'm adding a negative and a positive. I have the same rule. If I'm adding a positive and a negative, I'll take the difference of their absolute values and take the sign of the number with the larger absolute value. The absolute value of negative 6 is 6, and the absolute value of 4 is 4. The difference between 6 and 4 is 2. Because my negative number has the larger absolute value, my sum will be negative. Again, I'm adding a negative and a positive number. When adding a positive and a negative number, I can take the difference of their absolute values and take the sign of the number with the larger absolute value. Negative 8 has an absolute value of 8. 15 has an absolute value of 15. The difference between 8 and 15 is 7, and because 15 has the larger absolute value and it is positive, my sum will be positive. Here I'm adding two negatives. My rule was, when you're adding two negatives, you can add their absolute values and the sum will be negative. Absolute value of negative 3 is 3. Absolute value of negative 6 is 6. 3 plus 6 is 9, but because they're both negative, my sum is negative.